The What Works podcast is a production of Thinker Ventures. Learn more at thinkerventures.com.
Be able to hire Nicole.
That's great.
Oh, Pete, I think we may have a bad connection. It looks like you're frozen.
Monday. Have you talked to her about compensation? Jonathan! Speak up, Jonathan! Are you muted? It's really... Please tell me more.
Hello?
I love our chats, Jonathan.
You're listening to Thinkers What Works podcast. I'm your host, Jason Todd, with my co-host, Alex Gary, and today, Gary Anderson, firm founder and principal architect of Gary W. Anderson Architects here in Rockford. I've got a cool intro that I want to read for our listeners. Gary Anderson, you've been a driving force for the revitalization and the rebirth of downtown Rockford, which is so true. As an expert in historic renovation and adaptive reuse, he's been given countless hours to the community for this transformation of downtown Rockford, from urban blight to a place that is full of life and energy. Also very true. You and your firm have led the way in preserving and leading this charge for adaptive building reuse and visionary planning. And we are absolutely excited to have you here on the What Works podcast. I do also need to mention to our listeners and our viewers specifically that the video that you're enjoying today is courtesy of Meeting Owl from Owl Labs. It is a video conferencing technology that takes a 360-degree view of the room and then dynamically pulls out the speakers onto the screen. So, super cool technology and super cool guy we're talking to. Gary, welcome to the What Works podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, architecture. How does one become an architect?
Well, I think one of the things that, looking back as to what got me interested, but I remember riding around on my bicycle at 11 years old and, looking at construction sites.
Yeah.
And I remember I used to live by Churchill Park and looking at Redeemer Lutheran Church at the time was putting an addition on. And I think I watched every brick go up on that thing. And would spend nights after the workers all left to walk through the buildings and to understand how these things went together. And I think that kind of gave me an inkling, but I ended up going into, in college, in civil engineering of all things, which I found very quickly in the first semester that was not for me. And I had a friend in the dorm that was in architecture, and that was at SIU at the time. And he, I saw him sketching up and talking about architecture, and so I ended up going into architecture because of that discussion. He ended up becoming a hairdresser. And they had 5 salons in Chicago. But I ended up transferring to the University of Illinois, and I think there's Steve Kissick, who was a fellow classmate at Rockford East, was in architecture. And he's the guy that really got me interested in historic preservation. And he was talking about all these buildings downtown that, and that was 50 years ago. And it's like yesterday, and sitting in the studio talking with him about these buildings and his passion for them, one of them being the East Side Center. And when I ended up graduating from the U of I in 71, the city of Rockford was going to come in and tear that building down, which is a beautiful, Queen Anne building on the corner of State and Madison. And it was just going to be a gravel parking lot. And I could not bear to see that happen. Mm-hmm. So contacted the owner, and this began my, development career, I guess you might say. And green as can be about doing this, how to go about doing it. And I remember buying the building on contract and trying to secure some investors, and we ended up initiating some, selective demolition on the interior to take out all the rooms that had made it a boarding house, basically. And it was the original YMCA for the city of Rockford back in 1889. And uncovered where the pool was, the gymnasium, and all those things that were and the great fireplace that was still there, all the woodwork, the staircases were spectacular. And the attic and the turret, and I remember being up in the turret, and there was probably 1.5 feet of pigeon crap. And, the most unhealthy place you could ever imagine up there. And but it was that passion that has certainly dogged me my entire life.
Yeah.
What can we do to save these buildings? And I think that even going to Chicago, doing my own, trying to find tenants and that. And so I got myself immersed pretty deeply into the project. Ultimately, ended up losing the thing back to the original owner. And it was ultimately redeveloped by a developer out of Milwaukee. And so I think the work that we did, even though it was kind of a loss for me, it was a great learning experience.
Yeah.
But it also prepared a building to be redeveloped and really be one of the cornerstones of East 8th Street and all the future work that we ultimately ended up doing. And when I ended up working, I was working for another office, and Nolan Smith and Tyson at the time, and I was getting a lot of renovation work, and Plaza 7 over on 7th Street, was my first really commercial building that I worked on. But a few years later, the opportunity arose where they really didn't want to do that, and as part of the business niche, and so I ended up opening my own office, and started with a building in Chicago, and working on the Waterside building downtown. And the Rockford newspapers, I was also doing work for them. And so those were the basis of my first year in business. And
Wow.
And from there, I had a high school friend who was an accountant, and he says, hey, there's a building, he says, I think we could maybe redevelop, which became Spafford Square in the 300 block of East 8th Street. And he says, there's this thing called historic tax credits. He says, I think we can bring some investors in. And we ended up bringing in 32 investors at $10,000 apiece.
Okay.
He had the connections with his accounting business, and we were off and running. And it was $1.2 million to renovate the building, working with First National Bank at the time, and that was really one of the first things to get off the ground. And we were a little bit ahead of our time, but I think it was exciting to see, how that unfolded.
Yeah.
I was going to say, what's the pushback? I remember when I would talk to people in construction, they'd say it's so much easier just to build a new building. Because if you get in these old buildings and you start getting into the walls, you don't know what you're going to find. I mean, so was that the big problem initially, trying to convince these people to redo this building?
That's always been the problem, and it continues to be the problem. I think that one of the things that we find about old buildings, and I think part of my passion is that it's the history of it and the people that put their time and effort to build it. Back in when you take a look at the 1880s through the 1920s, and Rockford had a tremendous building boom in the 20s. And all the quality that was there. And it wasn't about being cheap or economical. It was about how can I build a building that represents who I am in terms of the quality of our business, the legacy that I want to leave.
Yeah.
And during the Depression, we lost that entirely here in Rockford. And I feel that we still have the vestiges of that Depression in people's minds. It's part of their DNA. And I thought, when I was in high school, that my generation was going to help change that, and I find that they're talking the same way some of their parents did. And it's like, no, thank goodness I didn't fall into that trap. But it's one of those things where you get a lot more back from these older buildings, and I think we're seeing that now in Rockford, where we're seeing that people are appreciating the history and the architecture and the stories that go with those buildings.
I was going to ask, I mean, it's taken you a long time, but now you're trendy. Isn't that weird?
Yes, thank goodness. But I do think that it's a national phenomena, you might call it. When people, even over in Europe, people say, wow, what a great bunch of buildings. And well, we have a similar stock here, but we don't appreciate it.
Right.
We have that disposable mentality of, well, if it's not usable anymore, we just throw it away like a can of pop. And I think it's that mentality that we've kind of marketed to and built into our psyche that I think this newer generation is beginning to appreciate. Let's step back from that kind of thinking, and we need to be more sustainable. And I think that sustainability is not only about the greenness of things, but it's also about retaining some of our built environment and being more appreciative of the legacy that those buildings left us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're a pretty prominent figure here in the Rockford area. Everybody seems to know Gary Anderson because you've made such a mark. I think because you've got this mindset from that 11-year-old kid who's just like wandering around a building that he probably shouldn't be in, right?
Yes.
But anymore would have been fenced off, and someone would have come out and nabbed you.
Yes.
You're doing the same thing. I mean, that's kind of your heartbeat now to look at these older buildings. That East Side Center, and unfortunately for our viewers, we don't have a picture of it. But what kind of period of time was that you were investing in that?
That was 1971, 72.
Okay, long time ago.
Long time ago, and then when we did Spafford Square in '84, and then in '85, '86, Stewart Square came up. DJ Stewart and J.C. Penney was on the block to be auctioned off, and then I went down there to say, well, maybe there's some developers that are going to be interested in buying this building in this auction, and maybe we could hook up with them. Well, as it turned out, the only guy bidding was a demolition contractor who was going to scrap it, and so I was thinking, I can't let that happen to this building.
Yeah.
And the bidding, I think, started off at $500,000. Well, it got down. They kept lowering the price. Started out at $10,000, and I jumped in and thought, boy, this is crazy. When I came home, as it turned out to be, I think I ended up at $60,000 to buy a 140,000 square foot building, and right out the state in Maine. And I thought, oh, boy, was this crazy? I didn't even told my wife that this is what we just did.
Are you still married?
Yes, we are. Wonderfully. And my business partner at the time, Terry Hodges, said, we can do this. We can raise that money. And we raised, I think, $225,000 in a couple weeks. To become basically a holding company, go find a developer, and here was the vision that we ended up ultimately creating for the building that you do see today. But I think one of the things that we learned right there at the auction of what we were really buying, was it had like 30 owners. The hospital had it, all these trustees. It was on leased land. And come to find out, there was a lot of properties downtown that were, the buildings did not come with the land. And again, part of the issues here of why didn't Rockford redevelop, and there's another whole story in itself. But I think that it was part of that learning curve and an understanding what were we really buying here. Mm-hmm. And we ultimately bought it for, I think, $93,000 after all the negotiations and and all the things that the bank really didn't tell us at the auction that we had to do. So, but it was a wonderful thing, and I think ultimately we ended up finding, John Fried and Sons to help redevelop the building, and we ended up pulling a tenant in. We were negotiating all of that. Blue Cross Blue Shield was huge. The mayor at the time was very helpful with his friendships with the chairman of the board of Blue Cross and Matt Cicero. So it was all these things that kind of came together that ultimately, started the renaissance for our downtown. Mm-hmm. And I think, when I look back as to what happened, when this thing, we lost a lot of momentum. And the city, started treating, developers as robbers and thieves. And I think that kind of just turned me off from doing any more for about 10 years. Mm. And but then, we started again really after the 2000, and was really with Garrison School. And when Larry Morrissey and Chandler Anderson came into my office one evening to say, hey, we want to redevelop the Garrison School. And I thought, looking at these guys, I used to be like them in terms of the fire and passion. Yeah. And it's like, I'm this burned out cinder here. What happened to me? the excitement that they brought to the table, and literally from that night on, that changed the rest of my life.
Really?
And so I've got to give them credit for getting me back and on track. And I think I'm certainly re-excited about what the opportunities were with our older buildings here.
So you
And-
turned Garrison School into, so the school's still there, but it's been divvied up into apartments, and then you added on some units around,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yes. And to, at the time was that, doing some upscale things there. The building had some wonderful qualities. The attic was spectacular. I mean, that was a cathedral in itself. And how can we incorporate that into the building? And basically, we ended up doing 2-story units, using the lower level. Then we kind of flipped the bedrooms upside down. And we did the same thing with the gymnasium of looking at the public, more public space of the house should be looking up at the rafters and the vaulted ceilings. So it was really a new concept and a new thought process, but what cool space. And I think so these were the kind of the drivers that we see today in terms of our loft development, and which ultimately led into our master planning work for the Prairie Street Brew House in 2005. And
You kind of developed a niche in
yes,
a way.
we did. And and I think as we looked at it more and more was, we have the vision, I guess, but okay, we need to put the dollars and cents to this thing. And at the time, we started developing, really the financials, the pro formas, because we were having a lot of people that would come into the office with all these dreams, but no business sense whatsoever.
Right.
And it was just like, we need to connect the dots here and develop something here that people can really understand. And I think, over probably the next 4 or 5 years, we ended up developing that financial modeling. That's really the basis of all the things that we do. And it's created really a market niche for us, that we're just not architects, that we bring a more complete package.
How often do you walk away from a project? Like somebody comes in and they have this great dream, but like you said, they don't really know what they're doing. So how often do you have to sit there and go, you don't have your ducks in a row?
I think that could be 50% of the time. But there are projects that sit there for maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years that come back to life. I never throw the file away. It still sits on a section of my big desk of these projects that are still on hold, that still exist. And it's amazing when you get a call to say, hey, well, I know I got all this stuff on this thing. I've got even some drawings or sketches, and even some numbers that we looked at back in those days, and how can we update them? And so it's never done, and I think that's part of the excitement.
Yeah.
Well, like AmRock. So in Rockford, this old manufacturing building, after decades, is finally being turned into a convention center.
Yeah.
So yeah, these buildings are around forever. It's just a matter of getting the right people in place at the right times.
Well, in the in the Zeoc AmRock building, there was a group of us called the Friends of Zeoc, and and when the mayor had told us that they were going to tear it down for $3 million, that we just found that to be unacceptable. But I do think that the thing is that when you end up saying we're going to save a building, you better also bring somebody else to the table to really save it.
Right.
You're not going to be just a building hugger and hope somebody comes to the table. And I think that was our whole premise. There was that for a building that was kind of even discarded by the Preservation Agency as not being worthy, that when we did all the research and everything else into the knitting history, that this building indeed was qualified as a historic structure, which would qualify it for the historic tax credits, were the huge financial tool. And that has, driven all the other things that have occurred downtown here, is that we have this wishful desire to preserve and protect a building and repurpose it, but we didn't really have the financial tools up until the state tax credit came along. That drove the Prairie Street Brew House. We were the first ones to do that, with the River Edge program, and then subsequently to be able to sell that to potential developers. When we ended up putting our list to, one, getting on the register, but then the next step was to, well, let's go find a developer for this. So we went out nationwide search. We found about 25 that did that kind of work in an old building old that did hotels and mixed-use developments, and because we originally thought about half of the building was going to be residential and half boutique hotel. And so on the sixth one was, and we'd spent days with a lot of these developers, bringing them in, really dining and wining and dining them to kind of show them about Rockford. And Gorman came in and said, "Hey, I like this building. I want to do it. Give me an option." And then we ended up going to council, and I'll tell you, no one really wanted to do this, but we lobbied all the aldermen individually to kind of say, "You got to do this, give it a chance," and then we ultimately, made that happen. And it was just an uphill battle all the way. And I think even when we got Gorman in, they decided he had a hotel guy there, a consultant, and the guy, we walked him through the building, and he was looking at how he could cover up all the details.
Right.
And it was like, this isn't the guy here. We need to get some information here. So, part of our team went out there and contacted everybody, all the businesses within, I think, 1.5 miles of downtown from that site. And we found that there were 30,000 room nights annually that they wanted their people to be in a downtown location because they were really tired of going out to the Far East Side and spending an hour of travel time that was really valuable for their clients that they were serving.
Yeah.
And so when we ended up giving that to Gorman to say, "I think you need another consultant, but by the way, why don't you follow up on all of these? Here's the contact information. These are the numbers." They came back and said, "You were right." So it was part of that grassroots effort to kind of say, we're not going to take no for an answer here. We believe in what we're doing, and this is the financial considerations you need to do, and understanding and the pro forma and putting this project together. And I think the other thing that Gary Gorman brought to the table was the EB5. We knew that no local bank was going to really finance that whole big number. Mm-hmm. And so that when we found out through Marge Beavers, who worked at the airport at the time, about the EB5 funding, that this was, really another huge piece of the financial piece.
Can you explain EB5 funding?
EB5 funding is where foreign investors come in to provide $500,000. They get a green card to come to this country and work. Whether it's their kids or whatever, but they raised $30 million. And that's money you don't have to go to the bank and find. So besides the 45% tax credit, which what that means is that for all the cost of construction, that you can end up taking that 45% of that. Really, the net's around 39%, somewhere in there. Of that project cost, that somebody would say, "I would like to be an investor," instead of paying the federal government for that tax or the state government, that they plow that equity into the project. And that's really been not only the drive for that building, but all the renovation, just about, I would say 90% of it now, has driven all what's going on downtown.
So correct me if I'm wrong. So if I'm an investor now, instead of just giving my money to the government, I'm buying part of a project.
Yes.
So I could make money on
for 5 years. For 5 years, yes. And you can also pay maybe 90 cents on the dollar to that, so you can reduce your tax burden, but you're also being part of a great opportunity to save a historic property and to drive a project successfully.
That's awesome. So one of the things, getting off of some of the redevelopment stuff that we've been talking about, you've made such an impact. You've mentioned a handful of things. You talk about the grassroots efforts, and I'm thinking grassroots tends to have this connotation of just a bunch of people getting together. And you said that building hugger, and I thought that was really funny because there are well-meaning people who are totally incompetent to do things sometimes. But you're not that person. You're an experienced individual. This idea of like you went around and researched and talked to all the businesses in the in a mile and a half area. That's not you're not just making stuff up. You're saying, no, I need to generate some real numbers, because otherwise you're just up against opinions. And so we need to bring the research, and that research should then guide our decision making. You didn't come to that by accident. So one of the things you've had a handful of, I think, pivotal moments, it seems, or leveraged moments,
Yes.
that you figured out how to put to use. And I think everybody has those pivotal or leveraged moments in their life, but then sometimes they don't know what to do with them, right? And so they just become kind of the same person, just extending their life. But you've grown and succeeded and come to a level of influence that 11-year-old kid didn't know probably he was going to have. Could we unwind this a little bit and give us those pivotal moments, because they've come up a little bit, from that 11-year-old kid who has this dream and he's looking around going, and he has an appreciation, maybe not even a dream, but an appreciation like, my gosh, how did this all happen and how does this come together? That's the first, it seems, pivotal moment. And then you go to college and you're studying architecture or civil engineering, you realize that's not for you, but architecture is, right? And then the next point was you're talking about the East, was that the East Side Center, where you thought I'm going to get into redevelopment.
Right.
And that kind of wasn't, you learned a lot from that
Yes.
experience,
Yes.
which you then carried forward, I'm certain, 40 years, 50 years later, into new things. Where are those other points, those pivotal or leveraged moments?
I think, and I've been blessed to, experience some of the things that I have, and in how your entire life sometimes circles around, and when I was growing up in Churchill Park, I played in that Keith Creek day after day in the summers. I could say I know just about every square inch of that place, and the tunnel underneath 20th Street, and all the things I did as a child, and exploring, the universe for me at the time, even riding our bikes to Belvedere at 11 years old, and swimming in the Kishwaukee River, and so it was one of those childhoods. And I told my mom how fantastic it was, and how she gave me the leash to kind of do our thing. But we had some other two buddies that were the same age as my brother and I, and so we were able to do that. And but I think that the work that we're doing in terms of preservation of even commercial properties, and Transform Rockford, kind of came about as to let's do this grassroots again. And getting people excited. And I remember walking into my first planning meeting for Transform, and I thought, oh boy, here we go again, the same old, and we're not going to get anything done. And I walked in that room, I remember it was over at the Chamber's offices, and it was just like, okay, here's 12 people around this table that think exactly like I do. That just flipped a switch, is that I need to be part of this movement. This means something, and I think to see, when 1,500 people walked into the Coronado, to kind of say, let's kick this thing off, I was like, okay, I'm with this all the way. And I think being part of that planning group was pretty exciting, but we had lots of great discussions about where things went wrong in our community and the planning aspect, and having been around for a long time, to see all of these things that we weren't really doing and following through on like we should have, like other communities have done, other successful communities. And so when we ended up talking about neighborhoods, it was just like, we need to do something. And I think at the time, that Spoke was having some disagreement about where to go with this thing. And Tom Gendron and Mike Shablatsky came in and said, hey, we need some help. And I think for what we've been doing now with the great neighborhoods, and going out there and doing what we've done now over the last year and a half, of really getting into where Transform can touch every doorstep. And I think that it's one of those things where we are, I'm excited and more passionate than I've ever been, because of what this is. And I think the other thing, and going back to Keith Creek, back in 2004, we put together a vision on that. And then they had the great floods of 6 and 7 that devastated my old neighborhood. And and the house that we first lived in when we were first married, my wife and I, was demolished. And that's where I did my first crazy project, in bachelor pad at the time. And it's like when you go by there, it's like there's this emptiness.
Yeah.
that I think when we start to see all these things go down and how neighborhoods are kind of torn apart by some things. But in that case, is there an opportunity there to redevelop that neighborhood in a different kind of way that maybe should have never been developed in the first place because there was a problem there back in the 20s and 30s. And so it's kind of, as I say, it's kind of come full circle from the standpoint of now with Zion Development has got a planner through a grant through the Vista. And being able to see how that vision now can come to fruition. And to be a part of that also ties into the great neighborhoods and working with that neighborhood. So, the serendipityness of all of this is kind of one of those exciting things for me personally. But also, how can we end up improving all of our neighborhoods? And we ended up doing the asset mapping for 17 neighborhoods so far, which is an important discovery tool for our neighborhoods. And I think, we pretty much have done the whole, I'll say, all the neighborhoods in each quadrant of the city. We've done a lot. And the passion and love for their community is so incredible that, I find that to be, there's the foundational piece of our community because there's people here that care, that want to make a difference and want to improve things. And that got to me, all of this stuff. And then when the land bank came up to become a trustee opportunity, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't need another.
I don't
need another thing to do. But on the other hand, how important this is to all the other things that we're working on, that we can provide our knowledge and expertise, and the importance of neighborhoods. And I think when we ended up doing some work on the EAV, of what's wrong, and that was driven by in our commercial buildings, and I use First National Bank, which is Chase Bank on East State Street, was worth $6 million in 1960, and the thing was sold for about $300,000, and it's just like, what the heck happened to all of our property values and how we've driven them into the ground? And how we've kind of devalued ourselves, and then really looking at what have other communities like our size have done, and they are far more protective of those property values than we are. We've given away the store, and when we've lost $1 billion in our EAV, we wonder why our
EAV stands for what again?
The equalized assessed value. Right. And I think that, in trying to raise an awareness in the community with our, I'll say community leaders.
Because the EAV is is part of the whole tax process.
Yes.
Right? And so the lower a building's EAV, the lower they have to pay in taxes. But that burden gets shifted off to homeowners.
Yeah, what happens is that we have now created an atmosphere where the commercial and industrial side used to pay the majority of our taxes, or a good portion of our taxes. A healthy community looks like 70-30. We are like 93% residential. The burden is entirely on the resident. And
that's why we're one of the 20 highest tax rated cities.
Yes.
In the
so
country.
For what we thought we were doing a good thing, we actually destroyed the basis of investment that really drives value in our community. When we don't have people investing in, we're wondering why we don't have a whole lot of new buildings. And when you take a look at what's happened over the last 10 years, well, the crash, everybody had that problem, but they've recovered. We haven't done that yet. And I think when we take a look at our residential neighborhoods, we've got some neighborhoods that are still 20% under the 2008 rate. In terms of, we're upside down here. So we need to do something about it, and how do we fix it? And and as I equate it to, sometimes we're going to AA here. We need to understand we have a problem.
Yeah.
So how are we going to address it? And there's been a lack, I think, by all of us to accept that. We don't want to turn people off to even any more investment. But yes, we need to do that. We need to be honest with ourselves so that we can be honest to them about investing. I mean, these were the same issues that we brought up to Gorman.
Yeah.
By the way, we want you to invest in a $77 million project here, but by the way, it's only going to be worth $10,000 at the end of the day. And I remember that conversation with Gary Gorman. He went through the roof. Yeah. But that's what our tax assessor did. And, and it was just like, this is wrong.
Right.
So.
So do you have, is it just a natural curiosity that leads you down these paths?
Yes, and I think the other thing, what makes our community tick? What drives it? And then I think is in our business, the whole financial picture has really become very clear to us, and to have our staff all understand that, and to get our clients to understand that has been been a wonderful experience.
Yeah, because it doesn't seem like you're in it for the money.
No, not at all. And and I think the amount of time that we spend in our community efforts is
Again, it's easier to design and build a new building.
yes,
Right.
and but I do think that making that difference has been huge, and now to see others understanding that has been very fulfilling. And yes, it's been all worth that.
And you've branched out. We were talking before we got in here. I mean, you're doing projects now in Monroe, Atlanta. Where were the other places?
Well, we're looking at some stuff over in Iowa, and so we're in 4 states right now. And sometimes you wonder how things kind of come into the door, but it's all about relationships. And and I think that I think we're one of the worst marketers in the world. But on the other hand, our work says all about who we are. So that word somehow gets out there, and and I think that that's the fun part of it, and creating really long-term relationships. That's we've got clients that I've worked with for 30 years. So,
do you find yourself evaluating a lot of the time? Like, I did this today, and then you kind of reevaluating it and learning from it tomorrow.
Yes, and and it's like even looking at projects that didn't get off the ground, or what could we have done differently.
You strike me as a guy who would ruminate on those things a little bit to learn the lesson, to figure out how to leverage it.
Yes. And I think the other thing is also looking and learning from others, that either did a development, could have been done. We always can say to ourselves, well, I could have done that better. But, there are other constraints that kind of come into play. And so you make the best of it. And, and I look at our Prairie Street Brew House, there was a few details that I would have loved to have done. But, as it turned out, it worked out great.
It's not like Star Wars where you could just take the computer and add some things later, right? That's what Lucas did with the movie later on.
Well, that's a lesson that I had in one of the first firms I worked for. They did this beautiful rendering of this building, and the thing had this ugly penthouse on the top of it in the rendering, and he said, well, just erase that. And it's like, there was for 30 years until they tore the thing down. It's just like, it bugged the heck out of me that how could we as architects do that and just ignore the mechanicals. And that drove another passion of mine about HVAC systems and making sure that, that's an integral, that's 50% of the project.
Okay, that's a rabbit hole that we don't.
I know a little bit about
HVAC guy here, right here.
Don't talk to me about bad HVAC. That'll be another podcast. So, what would you tell 11-year-old Gary Anderson walking around where he shouldn't have been walking around?
Well, I think follow your passions and dreams. And we have students come in that want a job shadow for a day to find out what's architecture all about. And, some do or go on, others don't. But, I think the most important thing is that it's not about the money. It's about what you enjoy doing. And I felt I've never worked a day in my life because I have had such joy with the work that I do. And to pass that on to others, to say that, follow your dreams. And what you feel in your heart is the most important thing to you, because you will be the happiest person your entire life. And I've found so many of my friends that they weren't happy with their work. And it's just like, oh man, thank goodness I didn't have, that situation. And that's why I continue to work today, because I don't think I could have more fun being retired.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on the What Works podcast. This has been a real pleasure getting to know you. And certainly our listeners in the Rockford area, I think, have learned quite a bit. And then these lessons, I find it always fascinating to hear where does a person start? What are those pivotal moments, and how does a person become who they are today when it could have gone so many other ways?
Yeah. Yes. Life is full of stories.
It is. Well, thanks for being on What Works podcast.
Thank you.
If you have a compelling story, contact us at thinkerventures.com.